The following teaching is by Jim Pugh through the ministry of God as Government. If you have never listened to one of our Bridge of Truth podcasts and wish to see all the topics taught through this Bridge of Truth ministry, please go to www.godisgovernment.com to find the inventory of Bridge of Truth podcasts. Now, welcome Jim Pugh as he presents another historical study of truth from history, Bible scripture, or current events.
Rhodes and Boers, Blood Diamonds. Rudyard Kipling stated in a poem about Cecil John Rhodes and Leander Starr Jameson titled If that, if you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor have the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that is in it, and, which is more, you will be a man, my son. In 1891, Rhodes became the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, a position he would hold for the next 5 years. Addressing the Cape Parliament, Rhodes proclaimed, "If you were to sleep for 25 years, you might find a gentleman called your Prime Minister, sitting in Cape Town and controlling the whole, not only to the Zambezi, but to Lake Tanganyika." Now known as the Colossus, he initiated railway systems that ran from the Cape through the Orange State of the Boers and on to Johannesburg, and from southern Matabeleland to northern Mashonaland, Rhodesia. The dream that Rhodes expressed in his Confession of Faith was coming to fruition. Tens of thousands of British immigrants lured by reports of gold, including the location of the fabled King Solomon's mines, and the offer of free land moved from the overpopulated cities of England to the lands owned and controlled by Rhodes in South Africa. Within the new country that Rhodes called Zambezi, new settlers came to produce more wheat, maize, and tobacco than anywhere else save America. Beef cattle thrived in the lowlands north of Bulawayo, and fruit, apples, oranges, lemons, pears, peaches, apricots, pineapples, strawberries, coconuts, and melons grew in such prodigious quantity that the highly profitable Rhodes fruit farms came into existence. To unify the vast continent into one enormous country, Rhodes laid plans for a Cairo to Cape Town railroad, a train that would traverse the Zambezi with its mighty falls, run through the meandering Congo, scale massive mountains like Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya, stretch boundless savannas and vast deserts, and circle lakes the size of small seas. The jungles would be cleared. The timber would be transported on railroad cars to the cities that would sprout up at the railroad stations. The natives would be pushed from their lands in accordance with the Glenn Gray Act, legislation that Rhodes initiated, and sent to work on the farms, factories, and industrial plants. This word, Rhodes believed, would assist the black natives in shedding their slovenly habits. It must be brought home to them, Rhodes said, that in the future, 9/10 of them will have to spend their lives in manual labor, and he sooner that is brought home to them, the netter. The inexhaustible minerals, iron ore, coal, copper, nickel, lead, bauxite, and gold of Africa would be mined by the black labor force. Riches beyond measure would be added to the British Empire, and it all seemed well. Within the grasp of Cecil Rhodes in 1895, Zambezia was renamed Rhodesia in his honor. But before this venture got underway, matters within the Cape Colony remained to be settled. The discovery of seemingly limitless gold reserves in Witwatersrand brought thousands of Uitlanders, foreigners, to the Transvaal, which remained under the rule of the Boers, Dutch settlers. The foreigners, for the most part, came from Great Britain, Australia, and the United States. Few spoke Dutch or German, the dominant European languages in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, and they were subjected to restrictions, including a 4-year residency in the Boer territories before receiving the right to vote in public elections. The Uitlanders were also subjected to heavy taxes, including an onerous tax on dynamite that did not apply to Boers. Rhodes, believing that the situation in Johannesburg was on the verge of armed insurrection, organized an invasion of the Boer Republic under Sir Leander Starr Jameson. A physician by profession, Jameson was also a member of the secret society, a director of the British South Africa Company, a drunkard, a foolhardy adventurer, and one of Rhodes's sexual partners. If successful, the raid would have eliminated the two Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, and enabled Rhodes to paint more of the dark continent a bright British red. It also would have represented a step toward the creation of a world federation of English-speaking dominions and allowed the Rothschild to greatly increase their gold reserves. The mounting of the raid showed that the Society of the Elect had become, within a few short years of its existence, a formidable force. Thanks to the machinations of Lord Rothschild, Rhodes, who maintained a stable of angels and lambs, young boys to furnish his sexual needs, had gained his appointment as the Cape Colony's Prime Minister, and Archibald Primrose, the 1st Earl of Rosebery, a new member of the Society, had become Britain's Prime Minister. Lord Rosebery had married Hannah Rothschild, the daughter of Mayor Amschel Rothschild II, in 1874. A notorious pederast, Rosebery was sheltered from scandal by his father-in-law, even when he was condemned of buggering the son of the Marquis of Queensberry. Reginald Brett, 2nd Viscount Esher, became permanent secretary to the Office of Works and Queen Victoria's closest advisor. Brett, too, engaged in pederasty and had a string of affairs with a host of Eton boys, including his own son Maurice. Arthur Balfour, yet another accused pederast and alleged sadomasochist, became First Lord of the Treasury. It was on December 29, 1895, Sir Jameson set out for Johannesburg with a meager force of 292 men, including 400 members of the Matabeleland Mounted Police. He thought that this small army was sufficient to conquer the 17 districts of the Transvaal, since it was equipped with 18 Maxims, the first recoil-operated machine guns. "I will simply blow the Boers away," Jameson bragged to Frederick Hamilton, editor of the Johannesburg Star. "I shall draw a zone of lead a mile on each side of my column, and no Boer will be able to live in it." The Boers knew that the raid was coming. Armed with German Mauser rifles, they waited until Jameson and his column marched into a valley beneath the hills of Krugersdorp before opening fire. 30 of Jameson's men fell at once. 30 more, including Jameson and Frank Rhodes, Cecil John Rhodes's brother, were captures. The remainder retreated in disarray. The effects of the debacle raid were immediate. Rhodes was forced to resign as Prime Minister and as chairman of the Charter Company. A heavy ransom for the prisoners was paid to the Transvaal by Rhodes and Alfred Bate, and Jameson was brought to England, where he was charged with mounting a military attack on a friendly state. He was sentenced to 15 months' imprisonment. Then came an unexpected blowback. Upon hearing the news of the raid, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany sent a telegram to Paul Kruger, the president of the Transvaal, in which he said, "I express my sincere congratulations that without calling on the aid of friendly powers, you and your people, by your own energy against bands which have broken into your country as disturbers of the peace, have succeeded to re-establishing peace and defending the independence of the country against attacks from without." The cable caused such an uproar that the British people clamored for war against Germany. The Kaiser had congratulated Kruger for killing English settlers without mentioning a word about the plight of the Uitlanders. Under mounting pressure, Queen Victoria sent this telegram to her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm. I cannot refrain from expressing my deep regret at the telegram you sent to President Kruger. It is considered very unfriendly towards this country, which I feel it is not intended to be, and has, I grieve to say, made a most unfavorable impression. The English hatred of Germany, provoked by the Kaiser's condemnation of Jameson, was a contributing cause to the outbreak of World War I. Because of these cables, Rhodes regained the esteem of his countrymen, and Jameson became a folk hero. Alfred Austin's first published poem as Britain's poet laureate was a tribute to the leader of the raiders called Jameson's Ride. It appeared in A Times of London on January 11, 1896, and opened with these words, "Wrong. Is it wrong? Well, maybe, but I'm going, boys, all the same. Do they think me a burgher's baby, to be scared by a scolding name? For may argue and prate and order, go tell them to save their breath, then over the Transvaal border and gallop for life or death. Let lawyer and statesman addle their pates over points of law. If sound be our sword and saddles and gun gear, who cares one straw? When men of our own blood pray as to ride to their kinsfolk's end, not heaven itself shall stay us from the rescue they call a raid. In the wake of the raid, the Boers, thanks to the Germans, became armed to the teeth, and Albert Milner, thanks to Lord Rothschild, became the new governor of the Cape Colony. The gold of Witwatersrand could be left to the Dutch, and so a war was rigged. The rigging was made possible not only by the Milner appointment, but also by Jan Smuts, a prominent Boer who had graduated from Cambridge. Smuts was a vigorous supporter of Rhodes and had acted for many years as his agent in Kimberley. In 1898, he settled in the Transvaal and became the state secretary, and he chief political advisor to President Kruger. As soon as Smuts was in place, Milner ordered provocative troop movements on the Boer frontier. In keeping with the script, the movements persisted until Smuts drew up an ultimatum, which threatened war if the threatening troop activity persisted. Milner rejected the ultimatum, and Kruger declared war on October 9, 1899. The conflict was, as G. Edward Griffin writes in The Creature from Jekyll Island, an act of careful engineering by Milner, Rothschild, and the Society of the Elect on both sides, British and Boer, one making outrageous demands and the other responding to those demands in pretended indignation. In the first weeks of fighting, the British suffered casualties that exceeded 3,000. In 1902, by the time the conflict came to an end, 7,582 British soldiers had been killed in action, 13,539 died of disease, 40,000 were wounded, and one had been eaten by a crocodile. 6,000 Boers were killed in action, while 26,000 white civilians and 1,182 African natives died of disease and starvation in concentration camps that had been set up in the Cape and Orange River colonies. The war had salubrious results for Rhodes and Milner, including the incorporation of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State into the British Empire. When Stead expressed his outrage at the war in an article that appeared in the Review of Reviews, Rhodes chastised his journalistic friend as follows: "That is the case which will be fatal in our ideas, insubordination. Do you not think that it is very disobedient of you? How can our society be worked if each set himself up as the sole judge of what ought to be done? Just look at our position here. We three are in South Africa, all of SU your boys. I myself, Milner, and Garrett, all of whom learned politics from you. We are on the spot, and we are unanimous in declaring this was to be necessary. You have never been in South Africa, and yet, instead of deferring to the judgment of your own boys, you fling yourself in violent opposition to the war." However, Milner had the grace to confess his role in the war. "I precipitated the crisis, which was inevitable, before it was too late, he wrote in a letter to Lord Frederick Roberts. It is not very agreeable, and in many eyes not very credible piece of business to have been largely instrumental in bringing about a big war. However, the 20,000 children who had died in the British concentration camps were of little consequence to Milner. When faced with criticism about the atrocities, Milner responded, "If we are to build up anything in South Africa, we must disregard and absolutely disregard the screamers." During Rhodes' final years, the symptoms of obsessive compulsion became more and more pronounced. He drank prodigious amounts of alcohol, champagne, beer, and bourbon, from morning to night. He shaved so often that he removed layers of skin from his face after each shave. He would soak in a tub, drink in hand, for several hours. Following this ritual, he would roam about his estate stark naked in the company of his angels and lambs. Keir Hardie, leader of Britain's Labour Party, labeled him a confirmed drunkard and dipsomaniac. His thoughts began to focus more and more on the United States. Stead observed, he, Rhodes, was devoted to the old flag, the Union Jack, a story of itself we will get to in a later podcast. But in his ideas, he was an American, and in his later years, he expressed to me his unhesitating readiness to accept the reunion of the English race under the Stars and Stripes if it could not be obtained in any other way. Although he has no objection to the monarchy, he unhesitatingly preferred the American to the British Constitution, and the textbook which he laid down for his novitiates was a copy of the American Constitution. Rhodes believed that the unification of Britain and the United States would secure the peace of the world for all eternity and the creation of a universal language. This merger could be effected, Rhodes argued, by the strengthening of economic trade between the two nations, trade unencumbered by tariffs, by the planning of pilgrim societies in London and New York, where American and British bankers, businessmen, and industrialists could meet in private to outline their joint goals and objectives, and by the awarding of Rhodes scholarships to Oxford University for the best and brightest American students, so that they could play an integral part in the formation of the New World Order. Once sufficient support for the merger was achieved, he believed the British House of Commons would unite with the U.S. Congress for the formation of an imperial parliament, the members of which would remain seated for 5-year terms, alternating their location between London and Washington, D.C. By the early months of 1902, Rhodes' health deteriorated rapidly. He was only 48 years old, but looked decades older. His failing heart had left him grasping for breath and racked with pain. Compounding his misery was the oppressive heat of that summer. During the daytime, Rhodes stayed in Groot Schuur, but when evening came, he retreated to a small cottage on the seafront at Muizenberg, where he sought relief from breezes blowing off False Bay. One of his aides, Gordon Lesoin, recalled, Rhodes would wander about the house like a caged animal, his clothes all thrown open, his hand thrust characteristically inside his trousers, the beads of perspiration glistening on his forehead beneath his tousled hair as he panted for breath. Into the darkened drawing room, he would go and fling himself upon a couch. Then he would start up and huddle himself up in a chair, and anon painfully toil upstairs to his bedroom and pace to and fro, every now and then stopping at the window which gave him that wondrous view of Table Mountain. Rhodes died on March 26, 1902, but that did not stop what he started, as you will come to understand. Jameson, who remained with Rhodes to the end, reported his last words as follows, "So little done, so much to do." Over the Easter weekend, some 30,000 people filed through Groot Schuur to view the catafalque. On Monday, the coffin was moved to Parliament in Cape Town, where thousands more came to pay their respects. The next day, the coffin was transported from Parliament on a gun carriage draped with a Union Jack to a funeral service at the Anglican Cathedral. For his eulogy, the Archbishop of Cape Town used 2 Samuel 3:38 as his text. Know ye not that there is a prince and a great man fallen this day in Israel? He urged the congregation to follow Rhodes's great example and dedicate their lives to the expansion and consolidation of the British Empire, to the provision of new markets for British merchandise, and to a new country for British colonists. No mention was made of his disdain for Christianity, his hedonistic lifestyle, or his treatment of natives. Then, in another procession, the coffin was taken to the railway station for a journey to the north. On April 10, 1902, a memorial service was held at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The occasion provided proof that the assassination of Uncle Sam already was in the works. Seated with Lord Rothschild was J.P. Morgan. Among the others who packed into the cathedral were General William Booth, Mr. and Mrs. William Stead, Sir Arthur Balfour, and Albert Lord Grey, who became one of the trustees of the Rhodes Scholarships. Changes made after Rhodes' death included Lord Milner assuming the leadership of the Society of the Elect, which he renamed the Round Table. Under his direction, hundreds of prominent British statesmen, writers, and bankers were recruited to the secret society, including Sir Patrick Duncan, Governor General of South Africa, Philip Henry Kerr, 11th Marquis of Lothian, and the British Ambassador to America, First Baron Robert Henry Brand, Managing Director of the House of Lazard in England, Lionel Curtis, Professor of Colonial History at Oxford University, George Jeffrey Dawson, Editor of the London Times, John Buchan, First Baron Tweedsmuir, author of the 39 Steps and future Governor General of Canada, T.E. Lawrence, one of the first Rhodes Scholars, who would become known as Lawrence of Arabia, the implant by the Rothschild into Saudi to create the country under the control of the Rothschild as we know today as Saudi Arabia, Leo Amory, Britain's colonial secretary, Stanley Baldwin, 1st Earl Baldwin of Bewdley, who would serve as Prime Minister of England under 3 monarchs, Sir Edward Peacock, a parent at Barings Bank and a director of the Bank of England, and Rudyard Kipling, the first English language writer to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. Before the group, Milner gave the following address in 1905. What I pray for hardest is that those with whom I have worked in a great struggle and who may attach some weight to my words should remain faithful above all in the period of reaction, in the great idea of imperial unity. When we who call ourselves imperialists talk of the British Empire, we think of a group of states, all independent in their local concerns, but all united for the defense of their own common interests and the development of a common civilization, united not in an alliance, for alliances can be made and unmade and are never more than nominally lasting, but in a permanent organic union. Of such a union, the dominions as they exist today are, we fully admit, why the raw material. Our ideal is still distant, but we deny that it is either visionary or unattainable. The road is long, the obstacles are many. The goal may not be reached in my lifetime, perhaps not in that of any man in this room. You cannot hasten the slow growth of a great idea like that by any forcing process. But what you can do is to keep it steadily in view, to lose no opportunity to work for it, to resist like grim death any policy which leads away from it. I know that the service of that idea requires the rarest combination of qualities, a combination of ceaseless effort with infinite patience. But then think on the other hand of the greatness of the reward, the immense privilege of being allowed to contribute in any way to the fulfillment of one of the noblest conceptions which has ever dawned on the political imagination of mankind. Milner's period of stewardship in South Africa proved to be of significant consequence. He administered the defeated Transvaal and Orange Free State as occupied territories and recruited into the upper layers of his civil service a band of young men from well-to-do, upper-class, frequently titled families who became known as Milner's Kindergarten. They replaced the governors, administrators, and bureaucrats of the Boer republics and worked to rebuild the broken country. The kindergarten comprised new blood, young educated men, mostly Oxford graduates, who would serve as Rhodes clones. After months of indoctrination, they were dispatched to the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and British colonies throughout the world. In time, kindergarten proved itself capable of populating the next generation of secret society. At the High Commissioner for South Africa and the first governor of the Transvaal and Orange River Colony, Milner drafted a plan at the behest of Lord Rothschild to transform the territory of Uganda into a homeland for the Jews. This was the territory that Rhodes required for his Cairo to Cape Town Railroad. A Zion in Central Africa would grant Britain control interests headwaters of the Nile and therefore a means of driving foreign interests from the continent. Milner retired from political office in 1905. He returned to England to assume a position of director at the Joint Stock Bank, which was owned by Lord Rothschild. He, together with Rothschild, continued to supervise the Round Table movement, which had established branches in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. The movement then published the Round Table, its own quarterly magazine. The names of the editors and writers were never mentioned. Along with Lord Rothschild, Milner was also co-executor of the Rhodes' estate and an administrator of the Rhodes Scholarships. These postgraduates' awards for study at Oxford University were granted to young colonists with the purpose of instilling into their minds the unity of the empire. This is no different today in the selection or process. The lion's share of the awards singled out for enterprising American scholars. At the completion of their 2 years at Oxford, these scholars were to return to the United States so that they could obtain prominent positions in academics, politics, and the media. In this way, they could serve to undermine the nation's sovereignty. As soon as the Rhodes Fund was established, massive amounts of money poured into its coffers from the estate of Alfred Bate, the Carnegie United Kingdom Trust, an organization associated with J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller. In 1913, the impact of the Rhodes Scholars in America was decried by William Fulton of the Chicago Herald Tribune as follows: Rhodes Scholars dominate the United States Department of State, which directs the doling out of billions in foreign aid, with the United Kingdom getting the major share. The savants also hold down important positions in the Economic Cooperation Administration, mutual defense assistance programs, and other foreign handout setups. You guys paying attention? This is your history and what is going on today. Despite this warning, the infiltration of Rhodes Scholars into top political positions in the U.S. government persisted throughout the 20th century, up to and even today. These scholars came to include Dean Rusk, Secretary of State 1961-1969, Walt Whitman Rostow, Special Assistant for National Security Affairs 1966-1969, Harlan Cleveland, Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs in the Kennedy administration, Ambassador to NATO under President Johnson and Nixon, Nicholas Katzenbach, U.S. Attorney General, 1965-1966. Senator James Williams Fulbright, Arkansas, 1945-1974. Senator Frank Church, Idaho, 1956-1981. Senator Bill Bradley, New Jersey, 1979-1997. Senator David Boren, Oklahoma, 1979-1994. Senator Richard D. Lugar, Indiana, 1976-2013. Senator Larry Pressler, South Dakota, 1979-1997. Senator Paul Sarbanes, Maryland, 1977-2007. Representative Elliot H. Levitas, Georgia, 1975-1985. Representative Carl Albert, Ohio, 1947-77. Speaker of the House, 1971-1977. Representative John Braidmus, Indiana, 1959-1981. Later New York University president. President William Jefferson Clinton, Arkansas governor, 1979-1981, 1983-1992. President, 1993-2001. Governor Richard Celeste, Ohio, 1983-1991. Supreme Court Justice Byron Whizzer White, 1992-1993. General Bernard W. Rogers, Supreme Commander of the NATO forces in Europe, 1979 to 1987. General Wesley Clark, Supreme Commander of the NATO forces in Europe, 1997-2000. Stansfield Turner, CIA Director, 1977-1981. R. James Woolsey, CIA Director, 1993-1995. Charles Collingwood, TV commentator. Howard K. Smith, TV commentator. George Jerome Goodman, writer known as Adam Smith. Hedley Donovan, former editor-in-chief of Time magazine, later a senior advisor to President Carter. Robert Penn Warren, Pulitzer Prize, winning poet and novelist, best known for his book, All the King's Men. America continued to remain the central focus of the secret society that came about because of a brainstorm. By the time the tombstone for Rhodes was set in place on a hill in the Metopus, J.P. Morgan had been persuaded by Nathan Rothschild to establish a central bank in the United States as a counterpart to the Bank of England and to serve as a founding member of the Pilgrim Society in New York. Cornelius Vanderbilt was called upon by Rothschild and Lord Rosebery to become a pilgrim and to dedicate a portion of his wealth to the grandiose endeavor of forging a one-world government. Waldorf Astoria, the New York real estate tycoon, was recruited by Milner and Lord Brett to become a key member of the British Round Table. Andrew Carnegie, arguably America's richest man, was persuaded by Lord Rosebery and William Stead to devote much of his vast fortune to further the cause of a one-world government. Behind such men of wealth and influence, the House of Rothschild loomed in the shadows. Against such forces, a backwoods character like Uncle Sam didn't have a ghost of a chance. Soon America hoped for was the America we did not know.
You have been listening to Bridge of Truth, brought to you by biblical teacher and author Jim Pugh with God is Government. For free access to all of Jim Pugh's Bridge of Truth podcasts, please go to www.godisgovernment.com. Distribution of the Bridge of Truth and all other teachings are available for worldwide distribution. Thank you for joining us in this broadcast of Bridge of Truth.